Well, thank you again for sticking around to hear a conversation about the film we just watched. So this was not your first time in the world of space and in the world of space travel. You had done a film previously to this, documenting the Apollo 17 mission. Going into this, did you have to come at it with open eyes and open ears, or were you able to sort of bring some of what you had done on that previous film to this?
Yeah, I think the Apollo 17 film was a short film, so it was 30 minutes, and it was an attempt to tell that mission story using only archival. And at the end of that, I was kind of spaced out. I really didn't want to make anything, and I'm glad he's here tonight because Steven Slater, our archive producer, Steven just had this obsession with a lot of the early Apollo missions. Didn't have any sound on any of the mission control footage, so I like to think he's in a basement bunker in Sheffield, England, with no social life, just working on this. But he had the crazy idea to take all of that MOS footage and what was publicly available at the time, which was all the audio, the air to ground, and try to sync it. And it's just, it's real, it's real work. So after we did 17, it was the first one that said, hey, we have this 50th anniversary coming up on Apollo 11. We were actually working on another project, and he was just kind of always a bug in my ear about it. And after some months, just kind of playing around with the footage, could it work in the guise of feature film? This was long before we ever had any of the large format film or knew about that 11,000 hours of audio that I mentioned earlier. We just started playing around with it and just kind of laying it out. And that's kind of how it started. And then shortly after that, I had a really good relationship with CNN Films. And they acquired my last film at Sundance, which was a dinosaur movie, and had commissioned a short film about Apollo 17. So they said, we want a moon landing film for the 50th anniversary, which this was 3 years ago, 3.5. And I said, you're not going to want this. It's going to be an art film. It's all archival. I don't think it's right for you. And it's kind of one of those stories, the more you say no, the more they were kind of interested in, I think. So 3 months into what began as a research project, when we were engaged with NASA by this point in the National Archives, to just try to quantify exactly how much material was out there related to Apollo 11, they gave us a progress report. And in that progress report, in this email, alluded to a discovery of this large format collection, approximately 60 reels at the time. And it really just, it shifted our entire, creative approach to the film.
And that adds another sort of puzzle piece element to it, in addition to what Steven had previously done to sync up the visuals and the audio. Then this sort of dual rediscovery of this new audio trove and this new visual trove sort of, I guess, starts that process all over again of trying to sort of figure out how those two can coexist.
Yeah, and initially, Steven's an editor, I'm an editor, so we work very well together. So the one thing we needed to understand was the mission lasts 9 days, so we needed to know everything that was available. So it was just not all of the film footage, the television transmissions. They shot 1,024 images of Hasselblad 70mm photography spread over 7 magazines. We needed to know where all of that lined up. All the audio that we had access to, we needed to put all that up. So we put it all in a 9-day timeline. And then when we were granted access to this 11,000 hours, it just gave Steven more ammunition. We needed to know exactly when, Bruce McCandless sitting at the Capcom station had on a white shirt. 2 seconds later, we didn't want to see him in a yellow shirt, which is typically what you see in a lot of fiction and nonfiction films. So we kind of had our own rules about, where things needed to happen and creatively how they could happen. And Steven just kind of went away and let's just take the hundreds of hours that we have of just mission control, just the cameras and mission control, and just try to find moments where you could lip sync, literally lip sync. I mean, sitting there and lip syncing audio. If you were lucky, you could get like a time, a general lapse time in the corner of the frame, and then if you're lucky, the cameraman whipped down, and you could kind of, maybe get a sync mark off of that. But it was really, crazy work. So that took the better half of a year and a half just to do that with him, and that's on top of all the years that he spent, just putting all the other stuff, all the 16 millimeter together.
And so on the visual and audio side, going into sort of sorting through these tens of thousands of hours that you had, were there particular things that you were looking or listening for, or did you kind of have to just go with an open mind and think like, we may find something that may completely reframe everything that we've been trying to do to this point?
Yeah, it was a little bit of both. I think all of us would have been fine if we, found Stanley Kubrick in a corner somewhere, or there was some audio, interesting audio, something, miraculous happening. But it really took the whole team that was working on it to just go through it all. And the other piece of this puzzle was also we developed a new technology, a new prototype scanner, a film scanner, to be able to handle all of this. And there's only one in the world. It was built specifically for a project, and now IMAX is using it in the London office for all their commercial operations. But back then, a few years ago, it was a combination of the brilliance of that company, Final Frame, which is the post house I used back in New York, of developing all of that. The organizational efforts of Steven, our audio guy, who also up in Toronto, our colleague, who was a technologist at the time. When we initially got all the original audio files, they weren't synced. Nothing was. That 11,000 hours was just on hard drives. It was all analog audio, so it had all this drift in it. And he, working with some grad students out in Germany, developed some software and code to be able to sync all of it up, remove all the noise that was associated with it. So by the time I got to Steven and I and the team, we could look at it, and now we could on off. So if you could picture every single person at Mission Control that had a headset, they were recorded on a loop. And we can now see through 60 different, audio channels who was talking to who, and then we just have to listen to it all because there's no transcripts for any of it. So my producing partner Tom really just had just this miraculous knack for it. There's no other way to put it. He found all these amazing moments, and it also begs some further questions. We never heard the 1201 and the 1202 alarms that were going off. But by this point, we were engaged with NASA's chief historian, Bill Barry, and his group. And in talking with Buzz Aldrin, he said, we had headsets and we could hear it. So NASA went back to the MIT Flight Dynamics group. They found the exact kilohertz tone that was in the earpiece. So we got to give that to the sound designer, Eric, and he put it in there. We were testing down Smithsonian's IMAX screen. You get Buzz and Michael in the room. Is this what it sounded like? A little bit like that, a little bit like this, and kind of hone it so we can get it as accurate as humanly possible.
And so great that you had that those resources to be able to speak to people who are steeped in this knowledge and are going to be able to tell you how accurate you're going to be able to be in those moments.
Yeah, and I kind of skipped over your question about 17. We failed on a lot of that stuff, but it was a great kind of primer for what we were going to do on 11. Within NASA, some of the astronauts, they really liked that short film, the ones who saw it. But there was others that attacked us for some things. And I made sure that we hired all of them for Apollo 11 and incorporated them. So, what did we not get right, and just try to make it, as much of an inclusive effort that everybody that was involved. So, again, just trying to be as accurate as what we could, and also as entertaining as we could.
It seems like when you're tackling a subject like this that is so much in the public consciousness, it seems like from your standpoint, one of the important things as a filmmaker you have to decide is the scope. How far to sort of let the lens that you're using extend beyond just the mission itself. And I feel like you strike a really good balance in having all the crowds watching at the beginning for the launch to get a sense of just how much this permeated the culture at all times for this sort of 10-day period. but then you still get to sort of hone in on the little tiny things in the mission that maybe people might not be familiar with. You get to kind of have the best of both worlds, I guess.
Yeah, the imagery is so striking. We just wanted to use every foot of it that we had, particularly the stuff in the beginning with the people and just the crowds. It really puts you into that time period, and it certainly wasn't lost on any of us. Every day just working on it, it was just a treat to get into a time machine and do that. I think the most difficult part was trying to. I'm always a big fan of films that attempt to show you geography of space. It's always a very, I don't mean space, but just like, I think of scenes in your favorite film where they'll have a master shot and you'll walk into a room and it just might be as simple as a minute of an actor walking into a room, but there might be a fight scene, 30 seconds after, but subconsciously what that room looks like and the dimensions, so you could stay in close-ups on that stuff. And we did a lot of that with this. It was trying to piece together, where you were in space, whether in the beginning, all the different areas that you were concentrating on, or once you get into space. A lot of the tech consultants really helped us out with trying to figure out, which way is the spacecraft oriented. A good example of that was we were looking at all the imagery that was shot, and it wasn't lining up. We couldn't understand how they were taking some of the photographs they were. And back in our office in Brooklyn, we have all 1,024 images spread across the wall, and we kept, you look at them every day, and we kept saying, how did they get this shot? Because the command module couldn't have been oriented like that. So we go back to NASA, Bill and his group, how did they do that? Well, it turns out, and again, it went back to the MIT Flight Dynamics group back in the late 50s, early 60s. They figured out that they had to go into this passive thermal control maneuver, where they actually had to point the stack celestial north and spin it like a top. And once we got that, it all made sense, because I'd always seen depicted in fiction and nonfiction films the command module stack on the way out to the moon, shot out, they call it the barbecue roll, and they roll the spacecraft like that. And it was kind of a nerd, thing, very technical, but it all made everything fell into place. We had audio of the Capcom saying, oh, it does look like you guys are in a rotating restaurant. That made sense. We had physical evidence of the photographs. So there was a lot of detective work, and a lot of it was distilling down things that we grew up with, and also talking to other filmmakers that had made space films before. Al Reinert, the Apollo 13, Ron Howard, everyone, all the old industrial films from the 50s and the 60s, and just talking and watching and saturating ourselves and everything, and then trying to shed ourselves of all that and present something new too was what we were going for.
It seems like another challenge that you have as a filmmaker is to sort of figure out where the balance is between the things that you find interesting and things that may serve the film as a whole. It's nice that with all of this extra footage you have the opportunity to include some tiny downtime moments that maybe wouldn't be in a more traditional approach to a movie like this. So did you feel like you, over the course of making the film, did you feel like you had a better sense of calibrating what are some sort of more mundane things about this process you can include to give people a full scope without it going too far into we're just watching people list numbers or take core samples or whatever the case may be?
Yeah, there was some the hardest stuff is, the things that hit the cutting room floor and just trying to stay, on target with what we initially sought out to do. I guess in kind of a roundabout answer, once we started engaging with the astronauts, they started turning over a lot of things to us, home movies and pictures, and we always knew, from the beginning, the little flashback sequence that was always going to be, we were going to give 20 seconds to each astronaut, and nothing more, and then that expanded to a minute for each. But it was very tough to say to Neil Armstrong's sons, Rick and Mark, I'm sorry, we don't, this isn't. Maybe we can put it in an extra or deleted scene or something, but we really want to just keep it kind of on this trajectory. So that was difficult, but a lot of the stuff is mundane, some of they're just sitting around mission control, the audio, I'm still recovering from tinnitus. I'm sure Steven is, and the whole team. I mean, you listen to, that much audio of just basically nothingness. There was a great, it actually hit the cutting room floor, but the first female flight controller, her name was Poppy Northcutt, and she was in the back room, and she worked for a contractor called TRW, and there was this great audio that just jumped out in that 11,000 hours because it was a female voice, very, very rare. And even rarer, she was talking in all this math, and she was schooling this old flight controller, this retro fighter guy, while it was when they were calculating the return trajectories, and they couldn't get the math right. So they radioed it back to her. She tells them, basically in this, kind of nice way, in her southern drawl, how they are wrong, and her numbers are right. And after the course of about 5 minutes, they finally believe her, and she's basically like, look, I'm right, you're wrong, that's the way it is. And it was this great little moment, but we didn't have any footage of her. So again, it was kind of our rules, but we ended up putting it on a deleted scene, for the DVD. But that, it was kind of a boring thing, but it was also historically very important. And the same thing in the beginning with like Joanne Morgan. She was the first female engineer that was in NASA, ended up having a 43-year career there. She was the first female in the firing room during the launch. But we didn't have any audio of her. We had stunning footage of her, but we didn't have audio. So it was kind of wrestling with, that balance of what to include and whatnot.
We're talking a lot about audio. I feel like we would be remiss not to mention Matt Morton's contribution here. The score is fantastic. And so I'm curious, sort of developing a atmospheric or musical language for this. I don't know that there are many composers who would have come up with something like this when given this prompt of making music for an Apollo 11 documentary. Were there certain constraints that he was working under, or certain ideas that you had talked about that eventually led to what went into the score?
Yeah, it was all Matt. I mean, I've known Matt since he's my longest collaborator. We've known each other since 3rd grade. And, when we made the dinosaur film, I said I wanted this big classical score. He was in a rock band for 10 years, so he doesn't know how to play a cello or anything like that, so he was kind of sweating bullets on that one, and he pulled it off. But then for this, he knew we were working with all this archive, and he said, I only want to use instruments that are pre-1969. And the backbone to that was going to be this 1968 reissued Moog synthesizer. He had no idea how to play it. He didn't even have money to buy it, but he went out somehow and got this thing. And there was only 25 that were reissued several years ago. If he was here, he'd tell you he got number 13, the one right before Keith Richards, number 14. But it was a wonderful way to work. As he learned it, as we were piecing together all the visuals and everything else, he was learning this like amazing. No one's seen this thing. They're incredible. They're these giant living, breathing monsters. And he learned with patch cables and everything else. And he learned how to play it, and more importantly, he learned how to do all the technical aspects so we can go back if we need to revise anything. But he pre-scored everything. So I'd walk in the office in the morning, Matt'd be up for 4 hours, with this like pre-scored crazy synthesized music. But it was great for me from an editing standpoint because it allowed me to play with tone and structure. I can't say enough about Matt. When we first start out, he's the first person I talk to. He always gives me, it's the opposite of what you just saw, but he always gives me we talk about the creative that goes into the film, and he always bangs out a couple minutes on a ukulele, and we talk about that'll be the theme, even though it's just kind of the blueprint for what's to come. And I always lay that in a timeline for all the films we work on, and I mute it. And if I ever get lost in the edit, I always go back to that. So once a week I'll get lost and, turn on that we did 3 years ago, and it gets me, just right. It's got the tempo and the measure to get me through the scene.
Fantastic. To go back a little bit to the scanning of the footage, were you able to prioritize certain things, or was it kind of all coming in a batch and then you kind of had to deal with whatever came in at a certain time?
Yeah, initially, so Stephen actually worked very closely with the supervisory archivist at the National Archives. The majority of the material was housed in cold storage at the National Archives facility in College Park in Maryland, outside DC. So the plan was initially we were going to go there and bring all of our scanners there and basically camp there for an hour or about a year and go through all the material. After Stephen did his research project, which lasted several weeks, they quantified exactly how much material we were looking at, and it was pretty daunting. So, because it wasn't just all the large format, we wanted to rescan all the 16 millimeter, 35 millimeter, anything that said Apollo 11 on it. The plan was ultimately that we were going to do it in waves, and we were going to have all of it shipped in climate-controlled vehicles up the I-95 corridor. 2 drivers, they never left. It was all white glove, very high security from DC up to our facility in Manhattan in New York. And we did that in over the course of about 8 months, and it was every few weeks. Probably the toughest thing was, you're dealing with the federal government. NASA and the National Archives are part of the executive branch of government, so we had to contract with Department of Justice attorneys. We survived 2 government shutdowns. It was very harrowing. At one point, we had digitized assets. It just wasn't the scanner, but we also had to develop storage solutions, because ultimately it ended up being about 2 petabytes of data. But at one point, the first government shutdown, we had about 30 reels in Final Frame's facility in Midtown, along with all of the digitized assets all in one place, in a very high security place like Manhattan. So we actually put a PA in a car, put all the stuff in there, and said just drive over the Hudson, because we couldn't get back into the National Archives. They were the first to go. When government funding runs out, NASA shuts down, museums shut down, National Archives shuts down. So we just had them drive. Lasted a couple days, that first one, and then the shutdown did happen when we premiered at Sundance. And it was so unfortunate. If everybody remembers, back in January, the government was shut down for months. So all these great people that worked with us and found all this amazing stuff, both at NASA and National Archives, could be out there. It was it sucked. It was terrible. But we got through it, and it's really just a testament to how many people just kind of rolled up their sleeves and made it happen over the span of the year to see what everyone sees, and that work actually continues. We entered into a contract with the National Archives. We'll be doing this project for another couple years, organizing everything, putting it back into the public domain, so future filmmakers can have access to all of this stuff and make really great films.
We do have some time for some audience questions. So if there is something that you would like to ask of this wonderful gentleman up here, let's start over here. Yes, you, sir.
I had a question. How did they get the shots up in the upper atmosphere back to the spacecraft?
Yes.
Oh yeah, that's a good question. The staging shots in the very beginning, when you saw that big ring and you see the third stage pass through, that was actually a 16 millimeter camera that was embedded. It actually had its own spacecraft, re-entered the atmosphere. If you look very closely, the film canister rolls out, pushes forward, had its own spacecraft, re-entered the atmosphere, had its own parachute, went into, at that time, the Atlantic Ocean, and then NASA went and retrieved it. And you can go to the Smithsonian, they actually have it on exhibit there. It's pretty cool.
Fantastic.
What did you say?
Let's go. Yes, here.
Can you explain what you invented that's now being used by IMAX and will other future filmmakers be using it, or is it more for the projection IMAX, what you work with full frame?
Yeah, so Final Frame, they created a film scanner. So, you used to do telecine all these years, and film scanning is what it is now. There are some other film scanners that are able to do 65 and 70 millimeter. The beauty of what these guys invented was it doesn't rely on pen registration, like pull down close. So at no time does any mechanical parts actually touch any of the negative of the film or any of the prints of the film. So it allows us to basically throw anything at it. So if you saw like all those great slow motion shots of the rocket taking off, those are this weird large format known as 70mm 10 perf, and it's just impossible. Like no one has any scanner that's capable of scanning that in any efficient way until this thing came along. So yeah, it's really great. They're still working on it and making it available to everybody. Again, there's only one right now. When those reels were coming up to us, we were really sweating bullets because we had a hardware guy and a software guy actually from the UK that were over, like literally writing code as the trucks were coming. It was like in pieces, and we were, luckily, everybody had their fingers crossed, but it worked out, and thankfully, but I think it's probably, I would say, 6 months away, maybe a year. I don't know what the latest update is on it.
And has any documentary ever been nominated for sound design or sound editing for Best Picture?
I have no idea. I don't know. But I will say to the sound design, we were I might want to talk about that. Eric Milano, like everybody, Steven's the newbie, and I've been working with him for 6, 7, 8 years now. But everybody else, like forever. And Eric's one of those guys, and I'm so proud of what he did on this film. I just can't say enough about him. He works in a dark hole in New York like the rest of us, and we were going to hire this big team to do it all, and we had the luxury of time, which was nice. But Eric just like, I've worked with him before, he's great, but on this thing, he just he just kicked it up a notch. He started talking to me about proximity editing. I said, what the hell is that? And he's, well, I want to know what the Saturn V sounded like at liftoff, whether you're 50 feet away or 2 miles, and we're going to do all this like amazing stuff. And he just really outdid himself on this thing.
Congratulations.
In the back, in the black.
Great, really wonderful. Thank you so much. Speaker, I was just wondering, and you mentioned it, the 1202 warning light, or 202, 12, yeah, whatever.
The error, yes.
So, I wasn't quite clear what it was warning. Was it warning that they were going to miss the landing, or what was that warning?
So the question was about the 1201 and 1202 errors during the lunar landing.
Yeah, they were basically the rendezvous and the landing antennas were switched on at the same time, and they were the landing computer, the guidance computer was being overloaded with data, so it was throwing out all the lower priority things and just concentrating on the higher up things. What was very astonishing to us was we knew that's been kind of documented in space history, that the 1202 and 1201 alarms, and everybody knew that Steve Bales was the guidance officer that ultimately gave the go or no go abort command, but it was actually a 24-year-old engineer in a back room named Jack Garman, and for the first time in our film we got to hear his voice. So it's kind of purposeful that we wanted everybody to kind of be muxed in together, and you kind of really don't know exactly what's going on, because that's when you talk to those guys, that's kind of what they felt like. They didn't know. But Jack Garman just happened to be training on that just prior to the actual mission, had a cheat sheet of what that was, and they were running it in a simulation, and it went off. And had he not have done that, they probably would have aborted.
Yes.
Ask this guy.
Couple quickies. You've mentioned the canvas and the shirts, which I thought was funny because I had noticed that you wore 3 turtlenecks, and you probably talked about that over the thousands of hours you've got this. The only guy wearing turtlenecks. My question though is, has this movie done anything to quell the conspiracy theorists? Has anybody apologized to you? Has one's been apologized to from the guy you punched out, etc.?
Well, first off, to answer the turtlenecks is pretty funny because 2001 had just come out. In fact, during the launch on the CBS News broadcast, Cronkite's sitting there and Arthur C. Clarke's right next to him, and they're talking about it. And Cronkite says something like, I'm still trying to wrap my head around that ending. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it. But that was like an ode, because the guys in 2001, what's his name, the lead guy had turtlenecks, so McCandless thought he was that guy. And you heard on the loop, we call it the 30 track is what it's referred to, the historical voice recordings. On the 30 track, the mission controllers are all talking about 2001. Do you think that's plausible that they, this ship did that ship did that? Nah, they couldn't have done that. They didn't have, all their thrusters and all that stuff. Really funny. I'm sorry, I forgot what the question was about the conspiracy theories. I always enjoy talking about it, because I enjoy talking about the counter conspiracy, so anytime I get questioned about it, I go, it's mind-blowing that millions of people all conspired against these 4 guys in their basements, that believe in it. But I can say unequivocally, having spent years looking at all this stuff, and particularly Stephen over there, you can talk to him later about it. But then also just doing events or Q&As with Buzz Aldrin and the astronauts, I can see how frustrating it is for them after 50 years, and I see why Buzz punched a guy in the face over it.
Let's go over here on the side.
Amazing achievement, Todd. What comes across so powerfully for me is such an incredibly different era as far as technology, and yet this mission is successful utilizing technology. And I just wanted to share that response that your film hit me so hard.
Well, I think that
Thank you very much.
I think that brings up a good point about this, the way that this footage is presented. In some ways, I think it's the technology that reminds you just how far ago it was, even though it looks like something that could have been shot yesterday, basically.
Yeah, I always love, one of my favorite shots, it was, a 16 millimeter camera. Let's not forget that, some of the most iconic cinematography ever done was by the astronauts. I mean, Michael Collins shooting the lunar module coming up off the surface of the moon, or Buzz Aldrin shooting the landing. I mean, they talk constantly about setting f-stops and film speeds, and, they were radioing down, oh, the sun's over here, what inclination should the camera be on? Let alone the great cinematographers that shot all the ground-based stuff in the beginning and the end of the film. But yeah, I think it really, to your point, it hits me when you see the docking in the very beginning, and you see like the rivets of the lunar module and the glass, and just how is that staying together, And they're literally, a half an inch away from certain death, and that was something that we always wanted to, have the audience feel, was that. I mean, anytime you're docking, anytime you fire something in space, anytime you're maneuvering, it's a life or death situation. And when you talk to the astronauts, you get that sense, even though on comm, they're calm as, as cucumbers, they are literally, when you talk to them in person or you read their autobiographies, Michael Collins' 1974 autobiography called Carrying the Fire is one of my favorite books, and he talks a lot about that, and how if we missed this by, this percentage, that was it.
Well, life or death stakes, I think it's a pretty good depiction of that on screen. Todd, thank you so much for coming and talking about the film. Apollo 11, it's on YouTube if you want to watch it in your own home.